And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar season. Tonight's session is titled Speak of the Devil, Teaching Histories of the Supernatural. And I'm joined by Dr. Michelle Brock, Associate Professor of History at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Welcome everyone. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at the Center. On behalf of my team, Jira and Mike and Meredith, as well as my colleagues in the room, Jody and Robert, I want to welcome you to tonight's episode. We're really pleased that you're able to join us on a Tuesday night after a long day at work. I know with the Halloween weekend coming up, regardless of what grade you teach, things start to have a certain rhythm during the academic year, during the teaching year. And this, for me, always was that point where you probably have known your kids now for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe a month, and the fall is approaching, autumn is approaching, and you're starting to get into a particular rhythm with them, both personally and through your content. In particular, I want to reach out and thank Linda for joining us. She's here tonight from Central New York, just not too far from Kirk, who's in upstate New York, and they both say that it's raining there right now. Jennifer's joining us from Marion, South Carolina, Liliana from East LA, and Rebecca from nearby Raleigh. Luann, thank you so much for joining us from Fauquier County, just north of Culpeper in Virginia. I hope all of you enjoy tonight's session and find ways to bring not just the content that Dr. Brock will share, but also the approach and the lens of looking at various conversations and content that you teach with your students. At the National Humanities Center, I'm privileged and find it a great honor actually to work around and near and witness the scholarship of these very established humanists who come to the center on a regular basis and do their good work in the humanities. And I think, if anything, what they really try to do is make visible the process of the humanities. Tonight, in some ways, we'll be talking about an imaginative history. That is a history of actors and characters and events that are inspired by the unknown and the invisible and the things of our imaginations that we conjure up and then somehow make whole and apply to the decision-making and the interactions and the relationships that we have. And I think, on some level, without beating this metaphor too much, I think all of our scholars attempt and aim and find ways to do just that through their disciplines. That is to really help us understand who we are by looking at all the many layers of both our real and our fictional world. And I'm hopeful, again, that tonight you'll be able to find a lot of entry points into your own teaching through that process. You can find all of the resources that we have shared with you in advance, as well as the resources that will correspond to tonight's episode afterwards in the Humanities in Class digital library. I would encourage all of you to join the group titled Webinar Series, and that's where you'll find the folders and the resources and the OER free and open materials that will allow you to fully explore this topic. It does include the readings that Professor Brock has provided in advance. It will also include the recordings of tonight's session, both in full and in segments, as well as the PowerPoint that we'll be using tonight. So bookmark that, find it, and you can know that and trust that these are vetted, scholarly produced materials that are free and come with a Creative Commons license that allows you to use them at will in your teaching. I suspect that we have a lot of history and social studies teachers with us tonight. And if not, I suspect we have a lot of teachers who appreciate the narrative of teaching. Please do take a look at our full webinar series and go back and sign up for any that you find interesting. Perhaps you've only joined us now for several sessions this year and you get a better sense of how we approach these and what our style and our tone might be. Or maybe you're one of our most loyal audience members and you're with us every single week, like you, Abel. And if that's the case, you may have signed up for some of them at the beginning, but not all. If you go back and you take a look at some of the history-related webinars remaining this fall, I invite you to join me with Carla Pestana on November 18th. She'll be discussing the world of Plymouth Plantation. Or you might join us on December 7th with Daniel Besner, who's at University of Washington, to talk about the very direct relationship between video games like Call of Duty and U.S. foreign policy. Join us on December 9th. Ed Ayers, former trustee of the center, will be joining us to share his work on Southern migration and the migration of the American South. And then later in the semester, in fact, the last one of this fall semester, please do join me with Mark Chansey from SMU. He'll be working with us on how to consider teaching the Bible in public schools and discuss all the prospects and the controversies around that. Again, these episodes are free. We invite you and all of your colleagues to join us. and we hope that you make time for us on a regular and weekly basis. It could be that the 5 hours you earn in each of these webinars is helpful to your professional growth. It could be that you need a lot more hours, and if that's the case, I encourage you to take a look at our online course catalog. Right now, our most popular by far is the Medieval Africa and Africans course, in which we debunk the mythologies of ancient Africa. Over a 5-week period of time, this is about 5 hours of work per week, which is, if you think about it, about the same as attending a webinar. So while I don't want these to compete against each other, I do hope that you consider some of our courses. Our next slate of courses is due to launch on November the 13th. As always, I want to make sure to point out and thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their continued hard work, particularly in such a disrupted school year as the one we're currently in. Josh and Kathy, Jeffrey and Kimberly all represent us in their local and state education environments. They also contribute heavily on reviewing the curriculum and connecting us to the classroom. They also serve as TAs, and tonight I'm pleased that Kate Van Haren can join us. Kate's an elementary school teacher in Wisconsin, and she's going to be dropping questions and links and resources that she's gathered around tonight's topic in the audience chat as we go through the program. Tonight's session is an audio only. It's a conversation. It is driven by a PowerPoint that Professor Brock has pulled together, but it does require and really lean on your participation. You can do that informally through the audience chat. You can also do that formally through the Ask the Professor tab. In both cases, as the moderator, I'll be reviewing and queuing up your questions and comments. When the time is right, I'm going to pause and maybe ask the professor to clarify or to expand on something. Please don't hesitate to drop those questions in the tab. If for some reason we haven't gotten to them, you feel like we've moved on, don't hesitate to drop them in a second time, and I'll be sure to bring them forward. Again, you've joined us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar series episode titled Speak of the Devil, Teaching Histories of the Supernatural. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Michelle Brock, Associate Professor of History at Washington and Lee Universities. Hey, Professor, can you hear me up there in Lexington, Virginia?
I can. Can y'all hear me?
We can. You sound fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you again
Great.
for joining us, for working through the technology behind the scenes, for preparing us for this pre-Halloween week of teaching. Professor, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a quick personal question to set the stage.
Sure.
I'm going to give you I'm going to inject you with instant credibility.
Oh, okay.
all these educators from all over the country. Do me a favor and describe in as much detail as you like, but really just kind of an overview. What was your workday like today?
Oh gosh, what was my workday like today?
Yes. What did you do today work-wise?
So I'm teaching 4 different classes this term, but I teach them on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So today actually was my desperate preparation for the future classes that I have this week. I'm teaching a class on the Reformation and teaching a British history survey as well as a first-year experience seminar. So doing a lot of prep for all of that, answering all of the emails, attending committee meetings, things like that, trying to stay on top of everything. And I know y'all have had, all the secondary school teachers have had a similarly overwhelming year, and it persists.
Yeah, and being overwhelmed is not a competition, and everyone's got a sort of a proportion of that. But I do want to emphasize that you and all of our speakers who join us on nights like tonight are scholars, and you write and you research, and you've got a really interesting narrative to share and expertise around. But you're also a teacher. You're an educator, and you work with young people who are struggling with the same transitions, the same kinds of big world things, both in your classroom and outside of. And I want to thank you personally for joining us after a long day in the classroom.
Oh, well, I am really delighted to be here. And I have to say, the semester has been so crazy with teaching, and I'm not actually teaching any of my supernatural subjects this term. So this is a really exciting way to dip into both my research and also my favorite thing to teach about. So I'm super pleased to be here.
Great. Well, I'm going to let you take it away with the slide deck. And again, as the moderator, I'll be bringing you questions on occasion, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share.
Okay, fantastic. Can everyone see the slide I just turned it to, the Speak of the Devil slide? Yes?
Yeah, we're
Great.
good. Yes.
Awesome. So I will say just in advance that I do have a young puppy in the background. So if you hear my own demonic familiar barking, I apologize if that's the case. Hopefully he will be kept under wraps. So yeah, as Andy said, I am a professor at Debbie Nell University in Lexington, Virginia, and I teach a whole range of classes, British history surveys, as I mentioned, a class on the Reformation, but I also have for years, really, since I finished up my PhD about 10 years ago, been teaching classes on the age of the witch hunts, the history of the devil. I also teach a history of ghost class. And so, indeed, the worlds that I teach about are often very strange to students, surprising to students, and different from the usual history courses they expect to take when they enter a liberal arts college. A lot of my students, I think, come in thinking that history is about the teaching of the Second World War or live issues on my campus, the Civil War, things like that. But what I try to do in a lot of ways is broaden their approach to what history can be, and I try to take a very interdisciplinary approach in so doing. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the histories of the supernatural, but also really help us think through how to approach these subjects, which in some ways, as I mentioned, are not traditional topics that you usually see in even a college classroom, much less a classroom at the secondary or elementary level. So just to start with a little story from the trial of Bessie Wilson. This is a historical snapshot of the type of research that I do. So between 1661 and 1662, no fewer than 600 individuals were accused of demonic witchcraft during one of the largest witch panics in all of Scotland's history. Most people don't know this, but Scotland was an intense place for witch hunting. And 85% of those accused during this height of the witch hunts in Scotland were women. Women like Bessie Wilson. Now, we don't know for certain how many women in early modern Scotland were executed for the crime of witchcraft, but conservative estimates put that in the thousands if you look at Scotland as a whole. And if you look at the trials of 1661 and 1662, nearing 200 individuals executed for this crime. Now, that number might not seem staggering, but it is actually, especially when you recognize the fact that the Scottish population in the 17th century is quite small. And obviously, this number is much bigger than the Salem witch trials, which loom very large in our popular imagination. In fact, actually, an interesting fact I always tell my students is that a Scottish woman was 12 times more likely to be accused of witchcraft than her English counterpart. So poor Bessie Wilson was one of these Scottish women caught up in the broader story and narrative of the witch hunts in this period. Now, Bessie Wilson was from a town just outside of Edinburgh. And the reason she gets caught up in these trials for witchcraft is that she, according to her eventual confession before the High Criminal Court at Edinburgh, she had reported that a devil some months prior had appeared to her while on the road from the market where she was doing her shopping to Edinburgh. And she described the devil that she encountered as a man clothed in black like a gentleman who asked where she was going. Very casual conversation with Satan on the roads. And according to this confession, which I should say was obtained under duress, the application of torture, she told the devil that she was going home, to which the devil had replied, apparently, quote, "Thee art a poor and confused body. Be my servant. I will give thee abundance, and thee shall never want." According to Wilson's testimony, she acquiesced. And as she told the court about 6 weeks later, Satan came to her at night while she was sleeping. The devil, according to her testimony, lay with her and bid her put one hand on her head and another to her foot and give him all betwixt with the renouncing of her baptism, which she did. And at the end of her confession, and this follows a traditional typical pattern in Scottish witch hunts, she named two other women that she had reportedly seen over at a hillside meeting with Satan. That September, she was convicted and given the usual sentence for Scottish witches of being publicly strangled and then burned. That seems harsh, but that's actually not the harshest of the punishments in this period, as we will talk about. So what are we to make of this episode of this otherwise ordinary woman confessing before the high court of the land that she had not only seen Satan on the crossroads, but also slept with him, and renounced her baptism. What do we make of why this happened, of the constellation of beliefs that led to something like this? And how do we teach our students to understand the witch hunts like that of Bessie Wilson? How to understand them in their own terms as part of a past that often seems like a foreign country, but when you delve in is actually a little bit more familiar than you might imagine. And why even, as I am often asked by sometimes prospective parents of prospective students, why should we even study something like the witch trials? Why should we study something like the devil? Why should we study things that have little obvious bearing on our own society? And I should say the sort of re-rise to prominence of the rhetoric of the witch hunt actually has made that question a little easier to answer, but we can always return to that. So I'm going to talk about this. Why should we study the supernatural? Why studying topics like the devil and witches and demonology are not only fascinating, but help us think in critical ways about both past and present and even the future. And we'll talk through some practical strategies about all of this. And I'll tell you some more witch stories as we move on. So whenever I talk about, and I wonder if my images are showing up. Are y'all seeing these on here?
So I think they're set up, Professor, so that as you advance, and I would suggest using your down arrow on your laptop. Is a transition. There you go.
All right, the magic of technology, right? So one of the things I really like to start with when I teach about demons or ghosts or witches is definitions, right? What is the supernatural? And then we can move on from that to what is the witch, who is Satan, how do these things operate? So here's a little bit of a sort of a Q&A for y'all to participate in. So, all right, I know y'all see the ghost here on the stairs. What other beings do you imagine populating the realm of the supernatural? So just in the chat, name some beings that when you hear the term supernatural, you think of. So we have obviously a ghost. Andrew points out this is a stairway with a ghostly figure. What else? What else do you think of when you think of the term supernatural? What other things that go bump in the night do you imagine?
And the good news is, Professor, everybody's kind of scooting forward to get closer to their keyboard. They can type in their answers. This is not a hypothetical, folks. There we go. Thanks,
Great. Okay. Angels, demons, aliens, fairies, imps, vampires, goblins. Oh, y'all are great. Okay. You have banshees, all of this sort of world. Pixies, goblins again, demons, incubus. Oh, we love the incubus. Ghouls, spirits, the Holy Spirit. Oh, Ricky, that's very interesting. We're to come back to that. Unicorns and so forth. Dragons. Okay, I love this. So y'all have really populated this sense of the fact that when you hear the term supernatural, right? Glenn Youngkin. Oh man, that's
nice, Charles.
Yes, I have many comments, but we shall set those aside. But speaking of scary, okay, so when we think about the world of the supernatural writ large, we immediately populate it in our minds with figures like ghosts or fairies, or of course, angels and demons, as y'all point out. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting to note is that the period that I study, that is to say the 16th and 17th centuries, the period known as the early modern era, these beings that you see before you, ghosts, fairies, even angels and demons, none of those were actually considered to be supernatural. If scholars were pushed in the 17th century, for example, they would say that all of these beings, ghosts, fairies, demons, and so forth, they are not supernatural, they are preternatural. That is to say, they exist somewhat within the bounds of nature, but are constantly pushing at its boundaries and expanding the realm of what the natural could be. Now, there's a being that looms large in our imagination that no one has mentioned thus far. And that is, of course, God. And what to me is really fascinating about all of this is for people in the 16th and 17th centuries, if you ask them what was supernatural, they would say, first and foremost, God is supernatural and only God is supernatural. Now, does anybody have a guess as to why we don't, in the modern era, tend to talk about God as supernatural? That is to say, why is that not what came to your mind? Why did you first think of ghosts and demons and angels and fairies? Why wasn't God the thing that popped into your mind when you talked about supernatural? Just answer it in the chat. Any speculation why that might be, why God isn't the person who we think of, or the figure, I should say, that we think of when we think of the supernatural.
And
What do
again,
you guess?
we're going to be patient. We'll let folks chime into the audience chat. You guys have been great so far. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes. Okay. So religion is such a third rail topic in this concept. Okay. So implicit in that answer, God is considered preternatural, popular influences because God is quote unquote real. Okay. Y'all are hitting the nail on the head. I think what's really critical is that we tend to use supernatural in the modern era as a way to delineate beings and creatures and figures that we think may not exist, or at least figures that we don't assume are the norm, that fall within the norms of belief. But of course, God is still a part of mainstream belief, at least in the US and certainly in the South where I am at. But in the 16th and 17th century, it was only God to theologians who was divinely sovereign, ultimately unknowable, and supernatural. Everything else that went up in the night was preternatural, but only that which created nature could truly operate above and beyond it. And that's the definition of supernatural, really, is above and beyond nature. Now, for our purposes, for what I'm going to be talking about today, I will use supernatural as a category that collapses both preternatural and supernatural, mostly because it takes too long to say preter and supernatural, and no one really knows what I'm talking about with that. But the reason I bring this up, actually, is to suggest that right off the bat, the category of supernatural and the way that we think about these taxonomies of belief and being, that is not a fixed category. And that has been dynamic throughout history and continues to be something we think about and revise in our own minds. And of course, that's why the supernatural looms so large in the popular imagination, precisely because it isn't fixed. But the key point is that when we talk about the supernatural, we're often talking about the boundaries of our own beliefs and what operates within the mainstream and what doesn't. And we will come back to this. So how do we talk about these topics? Where do we go from here? And what are the challenges, frankly, of communicating about belief, particularly in things like demons or angels or witches, things that might, to some students, seem very real or potentially frightening or potentially sensitive? And also, how do we talk about beings that some students might initially brush off as being farcical, fantastical, erroneous, wrong? How do we talk about beliefs that are no longer normative? So I want to talk about two groups of students that I often have when I'm teaching about these topics. And I think regardless of whether you teach at the K through 12 level or in higher ed, either way, you're going to encounter these sorts of students. So one group of students is a group of students who actively believes in and even fears the demonic. And so encountering things like scriptural ambiguities or culturally constructed ideas about Satan, even that language of culturally constructed, those things can be quite difficult. And as I'll mention, often when we talk about the devil in particular, we're also talking about ideas about God. And for some students, that can be uncomfortable when you ask them to look at scripture as a historical text. I'm very keen, actually, to attend the talk if I have time about teaching about the Bible. I think that looks really fantastic, Andy. And then the other group of students, depending on where you are, you may encounter these students more often, are sort of more secularly minded students who encounter historical beliefs about possession and witchcraft and werewolves and all of these things, and they say, that's irrational, that's backwards, that's superstitious, that's bizarre. So for all students, then, the question becomes, how do we deal with these sensitive topics? And how do we move beyond these artificial religion versus rationality dichotomies in order to better understand boundaries and practices of belief in the pre-modern world? So I'm going to talk about a few guiding principles here, things that I start with on the very first day of class, the first week of class, to try and set the stage for us to have honest conversations, challenging conversations, exciting conversations about belief. And the first is that, across the board, I think it is really useful to invite students to interject their own positionality and their own belief system into the classroom. Now, this may operate differently depending on what sort of school you are at, and I would never ask students about their religious identity, but what I do is on the very first day of class, I hand students a survey, and I say, if y'all are comfortable, you may tell me if there's anything that I ought to know about your religious background, and if you have any concerns about the material. Now, some students will say, I don't know anything about this, so I'm not worried at all. But others will say, I grew up in a Pentecostal household, or I grew up staunchly Catholic, so I'm a little nervous to think through these things. And just having that knowledge for me as the professor is tremendously useful. I also ask them lots of questions in their introductory surveys, like, what are your goals for the class? And it can't be about the grade, other things like that. I also like to ask my students if they're familiar at all with Christian history and practice, because a critical thing is, of course, that a lot of our students are not going to be coming from traditional Christian backgrounds. So some of the concepts that we may be grappling with may not be as familiar to them. We have to have a sense of that. So get the lay of the land and tell students that we're all bringing baggage to the table. We all bring with us our own assumptions about the world, just as pre-modern people did, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit more. I also really try to use the language with my students of perceived reality. So what we're talking about is pre-modern people's perceived reality. So it's not about a denial or affirmation of truth, but rather context and mentalities. And I point out that, ideas can be regarded as rational if they are consistent with the prevailing knowledge. And our goal is, how do we get into that prevailing knowledge? And then just the last quick thing I'll say about this that I always do from day one is raise the question of, how do we know what we know? And who are the authorities in our world and in the pre-modern world that set the parameters for what is within the appropriate boundaries of belief? And I point out that a lot of us believe a lot of things that we don't necessarily see for ourselves. So for example, I believe in climate change, that the earth is warming. In some ways you can see it, actually increasingly you can see it, but do I understand all the science? No, I'm a historian. I can barely do math, right? But I believe these things on the faith that I have in authorities who have the scientific method, have studied these things repeatedly, and know what they're doing. So we all believe things based on other findings. So I set this stage, and I think it's really useful to begin setting the class in a good way. Okay, so does anybody have any questions at this point, Andy, or should I just persist?
I've got a couple of questions. I'm trying to sort of figure out when I'm going to bring them to you. I'm going to hold these off for the moment. So let's keep going.
Awesome. Okay.
And, yeah.
Great. Just interrupt me at any time.
We'll
otherwise, my students, I always tell them that. Just shoot off your hand or yell, Professor Brock, you're speaking too quickly. I need you to clarify. Y'all can do the same. So the two groups that I really talk about, as I mentioned before, when I talk about the supernatural, are witches and demons. And so we're going to start first with witchcraft and think through some of the core aspects of witchcraft in the early modern period and how we approach it. So Bessie Wilson, who I mentioned at the very start of this talk, that poor witch in Edinburgh who found herself strangled and then burned, she was part of a larger tragedy of the early modern witch hunts. Now, when most people in the U.S. think about the witch hunts, they think about Salem, Salem for days. But what's really interesting to my students, and as I think important to note, is that Salem is just part of a much larger story. And in fact, actually, Salem is quite late. It postdates the height of the trials in the early modern period. So between 1450 and 1750, there were at least 1,000 individuals, about 80% of whom were women, who were accused of witchcraft in Europe and in European colonies like North America. And of these, roughly half, that is to say about 50,000 of them, met their demise at the stake, at the noose, or sometimes in creative methods of execution, like being tied to an oar of a boat and sailed out to sea. Now, the witch hunts are so complicated, and so any straightforward explanations for them are not going to do them justice. Historians have worked so hard to explain this fascinating phenomenon, why it happened, and how to understand the documents that are our sources for understanding this. And behind the phenomenon of witch hunting are social causes, religious causes, judicial, political, gendered, so forth, none of which is solely responsible for this tragedy. And the reason I love teaching the supernatural across the board, and particularly the witch hunts, is they're messy. And history is messy, right? That's going to be really critical to all of this. Now, in this period, which is the early modern period, I should say, if anybody says to you that the witch hunts were medieval, they were not. The witch hunts, the height of the witch hunts, that is in the early modern era. And that sits uncomfortably with us for a number of reasons. When we think of the early modern period, we think of Shakespeare and the Renaissance and, the beginnings of the so-called scientific revolution and all of those things. We don't necessarily think of witches, at least at a popular level. People often say they are medieval, but they are not. We'll come back to this. And during this period, the early modern era, many people, especially the literate elite, but also ordinary people, viewed their world in totally polarized terms, with an ever-active Satan seeking to overthrow the kingdom of Christ with the help of witches, demons, and other earthly adversaries. And these individuals believed that witches entered into a pact with Satan. You see there on the left of, I think it'll be the left of y'all's screen, an image from this big compendium of witches that shows all of the different stages that people envision witches entering into the demonic pact. What's interesting about this woodcut, just as a side note, if y'all see the one on the left, it's a reverse baptism, an inversion of the Christian practice of baptism. You might notice that it's a man kneeling forward, and we know that most of those accused of witchcraft are women, but also everyone's really well dressed. Like, what's going on? It looks like, they're going to a party, but they're meeting Satan. Woodcuts, like any early modern source, has to be viewed with a sense of scrutiny and a critical lens. And actually, woodcuts were so expensive to make that often they'd use images from other texts and basically append them to new pieces of woodcuts like Satan here and mash them together. So probably the figures of this man and the nicely dressed women and other men in the background were from an image of a court scene, but then they get recycled into the pact. So if you didn't know better, you might look at this and think, oh gosh, these are a lot of like really wealthy, powerful, elite men who are entering into the demonic pact. Not the case, but woodcuts aren't always accurate. So sorry, that's off on a tangent, but tremendously interesting to me. So people in this period believed witches entered into demonic pacts, had sex with Satan, surrendered their souls, vowed to do his evil bidding, flew to demonic Sabbaths under cover of night where they engaged in all sorts of illicit activity, things like cannibalistic infanticide and other sort of debauched acts. And these were serious beliefs. They were at the center of actually intellectual life in early modern Europe. They were not on the fringe, right? This is really critical. Now, arguably, every early modern European, from the peasant all the way to the prince, believed in the existence of the devil and the ability of witches to perform harmful magic. Harmful magic at this time is known as maleficia. And historians debate the extent to which ordinary people would have connected harmful magic to the devil without the pushing and publishing and prodding of authorities. It really is authority figures, elites in early modern Europe, state elites and members of the clergy who said all witches get their magical powers from deals with the devil. So they are not just agents of sort of disorder, destroying your crops, making your husband grow impotent or whatever. They are actually part of a conspiracy to overthrow Christendom. And that is really important. So it's not just witchcraft, but it's demonic witchcraft. And these beliefs, they crystallized in an age of religious turmoil, right, the Reformation, and collided dramatically with key developments in things like criminal law, other things like regional social tensions. And this leads to this 300-year period, as I say, that claims the lives of tens of thousands of individuals. And these individuals died for an imagined crime. And the reason I say imagined is that while some of them, although certainly not the majority, may have dabbled in a little magic here and there, none of them were joining these giant demonic orgies, eating babies, that sort of thing. Or at least that is beyond the realm of evidence that historians have access to. But they certainly were certainly innocent, and it makes this a tragedy. Does anybody have any questions just about that very broad overview of the witch hunts before I get into how I start teaching about it?
Yeah, we do have some questions that are starting to queue up I'd like to bring to you. And the first one I'd like to bring from Kate. Kate's our TA tonight. And she wonders if you could talk a little bit more about why so many more women in Scotland were accused of witchcraft than in places like England.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are two parts to that question that I'll take up. So the first is that Scotland was just more ripe for witch hunting than England because of both its religious climate, which was, diehard Calvinist, and the clergy were very involved in encouraging the witch hunts. Scotland had a lot more political turmoil, and actually Scotland had a king in the latter part of the latter part of the 16th century, who I'll talk about in just a bit, who encouraged witch hunting. So the political system was ripe for that. And also the legal system in Scotland was quite decentralized. And what that meant was these local courts that were overseeing witchcraft prosecutions could basically get away with using torture willy-nilly, even though they were not supposed to, because there was not a high level of judicial oversight. England, on the other hand, is a bit more politically stable, it's a bit more religiously moderate, and a bit more centralized, actually a lot more centralized in terms of its court system. The only time England has really intense witch hunts that match Scotland's is during the 1640s. Now, to the second part of the question, which is why women, oh man, that's like a whole talk in and of itself, but it's a tremendously great question. It's really important. One is that women, for scriptural reasons, which I will talk about in just a second, are believed to be more vulnerable to Satan. They are believed to be more susceptible to the wiles of the devil because they are the weaker sex. So from the very outset, from the early days of Christendom, that is the critical idea about women, that they're vulnerable to the assaults of Satan. I'll explain more why later. It's a patriarchal society. That's not a surprise to anyone. And when people thought about what individuals in society would be most likely to do a deal with the devil in order to get a greater degree of political, economic, social power, it's going to be those who are in a widely weakened position, which is women. And that's an important part of it. Why it's not women, there's this myth that midwives tended to be accused of witchcraft, but that's actually not the case. Midwives were largely trusted by the community, and for a person to be accused of witchcraft, they had to have amassed a negative reputation. And if that had happened, and if they were a woman in a vulnerable position, particularly one who's unmarried or widowed, they would be especially susceptible to being accused of witchcraft. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's a great one.
Right, I think it does. And now I'm going to complicate it just a little with Sundina's question. Sundina is a teacher in Los Angeles Unified, and she wonders if you can now add the class layer. Would women of power be more or less likely to be accused of witchcraft?
Great question. So one thing that I do want to note is we don't actually know the ages, marital statuses, or jobs of most of the women accused of witchcraft. So part of this answer that I'm going to give you is based on the sample that we have, but a lot of these court records, which are the source for these trials, don't actually tell us some of these things. So generally speaking, though, those accused of witchcraft in Europe across the board did come from the sort of lower to middling level of society. So often they weren't actually the poorest of the poor, but they certainly were not well off. And in many cases, actually, when you start to have, say, the wife of a local magistrate who gets accused, or the wife of a minister, then sometimes the brakes are put on the trial. So it's certainly the case that those who are of lower socioeconomic status are more vulnerable. But historians have largely overturned that older sort of theory of people being accused of witchcraft because they went begging at someone's house and were turned away and then muttered a curse and then got accused as sort of a projection of guilt. That has largely been debunked by historians, but most are coming from the lower social strata. Salem is actually a really interesting exception. The first three witches, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, who are accused in Salem, they're all straight out of central casting, right? Tituba is an enslaved woman working in the home of the minister. Both Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good are poor, don't have social standing, have bad reputations, and so forth. But then as Salem goes on, actually you have more and more respectable members of the community being accused. So Salem kind of quickly moves to the upper echelon in a way that's quite different than other patterns in Europe.
Thank you. Last question before we move on,
Yeah.
Professor. Are you aware of, or can you speak at all to the migration of these dynamics as communities, as families, as individuals move, even if they move internally in a country or an area or immigrate to another place? Can we also trace the migration of these ideas?
Yes, yes, we can. Pre-modern people are super mobile. We tend not to think that that's the case, but they are actually a lot more mobile than we tend to imagine. So, for example, you have this at the sort of elite level. So some of the ideas that make up the corpus of Scottish witchcraft beliefs, some historians have argued, actually came from Denmark. The Scottish king James VI goes over to get his bride, Anne of Denmark, and when he's spending time there, he's hearing a lot of ideas that are central to continental ideas about witch belief, that is to say, things that they believe in, like the Holy Roman Empire and elsewhere in Europe. And he transports some of those back to Scotland. Now, other historians have argued with that interpretation, but there's certainly the migration, not just in terms of text between the continent of Europe to the British Isles, but also in terms of individuals. Also, every clergyman is usually spending time in some European institution learning about these things. But these things also move with ordinary people. The reason New England, of course, is so famous for its witch trials is because of the Puritans who populated the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other areas. And they bring with them this abiding Puritan obsession with the devil, as well as a court system through which they can prosecute individuals for this crime. And that exactly, that's precisely what happens in that context. The witch trials of Salem in a lot of ways resemble the English witch hunts of the 1640s, which were ruled over by Puritans during their period of power. If you've ever seen the film The Witch, I don't know how many of y'all have seen that, the Roger Eggers film. It's absolutely fantastic. I just love it. But it's a tremendously good representation of Puritan witch belief, but it does have a few what we would call continental elements, like a very grisly and fantastical demonic Sabbath. So yes, there's a lot of migration.
And I know we have a lot of ground to cover still, but one more question that comes to mind. Professor, can you talk a little bit or clarify the relationship between crime and penalty? And what I mean is, how have we looked at the sort of the legal, legislative punishment, the crime and punishment side of this as it responds to accusations of witchcraft? Is that similar in all places, or does it evolve over time and in place and with people?
Oh, great question. Yeah, that's whoever asked that question, very astute.
That was me.
Oh, is that you? Okay, Andy, gold star.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I'm a historian who works mostly with court records. So I'm like, oh, yes, talk about the courts. So witchcraft in general in Europe is, and by Europe I'm including, sadly I don't know if I can talk about Britain anymore as part of Europe, but of course I'm including Britain in this sort of story of European witch hunts. And they were usually persecuted through a variety of different courts. So often they would start at the local level, moving through an ecclesiastical court at the sort of, in Scotland, it's the Kirk session, and move their way up to higher branches of ecclesiastical courts, church courts, which are tasked with policing moral behavior, right? And then they get kicked over to, very often, the secular courts, criminal courts, that can then, if necessary, mete out the punishment of execution. All the church court can do is say, you're excommunicated, but they can't actually execute someone. The reason that that's sort of important is because it suggests to us that witchcraft is both a religious and secular crime. And in some places, witches are deemed heretics, and the places where that is true, the punishments are incredibly intense and they're ratcheted up often over time, particularly with the introduction of something that we call the inquisitorial method, whereby it's not just judges waiting for cases to be brought to them, but rather judges and ministers and magistrates actively going out and looking for witches, as opposed to waiting for someone to come and accuse another. And that system and the thinking about witchcraft as a crime of heresy, that is implemented in the Holy Roman Empire, where there are the most intense witch hunts, where witches are burned alive as heretics would be. It's an important component of witch belief in Scotland, but in places like England, witches are actually more considered to be traitors against the state because they subvert their own commitment to the Church of England, thereby rejecting the monarch, who is the head of the Church of England. And that has the effect of their being treated really as traitors, and that's why they're hung according to English common law. And that's true in Salem as well. So I don't know if that's a very clear answer, but hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of things.
It definitely is, and it's actually a really nice way of looking at the push-pull of this entire issue.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Mickey, my job is the moderator too.
Okay.
So I'll stop slowing you down. We've got about 45 minutes left.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Wow. All right. Well, we shall persist. So the first questions that students ask me when we start to think about the witch hunts is, why did this happen? How could this happen? And what does this all mean? And as has already been suggested by some of the answers I've given y'all, there are so many ways to think about the witch hunts and so much regional and chronological variations. And indeed, scholars are still trying to sort this out themselves. But the one thing that I just want to point out about this, and an answer to this trio of questions in some ways, is that the witch hunt happened because people believed in and feared witches, though not everyone believed in them and feared them in the same way. Now, that sounds like an obvious answer, but we'll unpack it a bit more. They happened because people believed in witches and were afraid of them. And they also happened, and this is to the how, because early modern society had the mechanics of the state, of the law, and of communication, where in the heyday of the printing press, and we'll talk about that more, these things were all in place to make the witch hunts happen. So witch hunting was not on the fringes of belief. It engaged the greatest minds of the era. And so we have to agree as a class, right, and as scholars who study this, collectively not to dismiss them so that we can understand them. How do we get into this belief, this fear, and the mechanics of why it happened? How do we encounter strangeness? How do we look at something like this depiction of the witches' Sabbath from the Holy Roman Empire and explain what the heck is going on here, right? How do we understand how this was in the mainstream of European belief? Well, one thing that I always say to students is that the witch hunts were a manifestation of the anxieties of the age, right? We all live in just unbelievable levels of comfort comparatively to pre-modern folks. We live in unbelievable levels of stability and security, even now, even in the era of COVID, compared to folks who are constantly encountering death, disease, warfare, all of those things. And to some extent, understanding that we operate in a different context and thinking about actually what it means in some ways to be quote unquote modern allows us to then get into more about the pre-modern world, the conditions of the pre-modern world that made things right for this sort of thinking. And it also reminds our students that it's probably an erroneous and certainly arrogant assumption to assume the modern age is more morally superior than the past. That is to say, in the context of their perceived reality, it was essential to hunt witches. That's not to say it wasn't a tragedy. That's not to say it wasn't a wrong, but it is to say that it was rational in their worldview. They believed they were doing the right thing. And I always try to talk to my students about historical relativism versus moral relativism here. I'm not suggesting that they should look at the age of the witch hunts and think, oh, well, if most people thought they were doing the right thing, if they didn't think that they were presiding over a miscarriage of justice, then okay, let's just understand that. I stress that that's not the case. I'm not asking students to be morally relativistic, but I am asking them to be historically relativist, right? That is to say, to understand the witch hunts in their own time. And I think that is really crucial. And Darren Ulrich, I think he said this in the chapter that I assigned for y'all, that we completely miss the point of the tragedy of the witch hunts if we see them merely as a miscarriage of justice presided over by mad and bad people. The tragedy is more complex, is more difficult if we recognize that people thought they were doing good in a very systematized way. Now, why did they think they were doing good? Why did they think it was systematized? And this is where I'm going to bring in Andy for a little audience or a little moderator participation here.
Absolutely.
So let me just say that one of the key features of the early modern period is a willingness to accept the authority of reputable texts to establish the facts of life. Now, the most reputable of all the texts is the Bible. Protestants and Catholics will debate other sorts of texts that are considered to be reputable. But what is critical is that people were engaged in a thoroughgoing intellectual debate about precisely the mechanics of witches, the mechanics of demons, and how this all transpired. And the greatest minds of the generation, as I say, were writing things, making the case that witches have to be hunted, they have to be eradicated. There's no way out of that. The most famous of these, if you've heard of any of them, is the Malleus Maleficarum, written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican German witch hunter in 1486. Now, this text is aggressively misogynistic, almost ludicrously so. Whenever I assign it in my class, inevitably some of my students want to throw it across the room. It's also set up as a manual for how to hunt witches. But it also contains some very interesting passages that might seem very strange indeed to my students. So Andy, if you would read this, please.
Absolutely. And what then is to be thought of those witches who sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many and is a matter of common report? For a certain man tells that, when he has lost his member, he approached a known witch to ask her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and that he might take which he liked out of the nest, to which there were several members. And when he tried to take the big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, "because it belongs to the parish priest."
Okay. I always make my students read this passage. Now, those of y'all teaching like elementary school, or middle school, you may want to set this one aside. But the reason I assign this actually, so this is from a very serious manual about witch hunting. And on the face of it, it seems patently absurd, right? That there's this core story about witches stealing man's members and hiding them in trees. But it's not actually absurd, right? Because many of the crimes attributed to witches concern sexuality, sex with the devil, procuring abortions, causing sterility and stillbirth, impeding sexual relations between man and wife, and so on and so forth. And indeed, the author of the Malleus Maleficarum said that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, from which women are insatiable. And this is actually not just a sort of manifestation of anxiety about sex and bodies and fertility and so forth, and also some degree of insecurity among men who are very invested in making sure they're populating their society. But also it's a reflection of folkloric norms. And I think what's really interesting to this image is that you have all the way back to the 13th centuries images of penis trees, right? Painted on murals. And they're framed as, this is a common report. Everybody knows witches steal penises and put them in trees. And this derives from a very old idea about women turning into birds and stealing members and so forth. Now, this folkloric idea makes its way into actual witch trials. There's a case, for example, in 1652 in Germany where a young man accused an older woman of taking his penis by witchcraft, right? Apparently, he was peeing in his garden outside, and this old woman walked by and made a sort of jokey comment about him doing that. And then when he got home, he claimed he couldn't see his member anymore, right? And then there was an ensuing case of witchcraft, a sort of deep masculine fear playing out. And this was the type of text that was successful because it combines folklore with serious theological thinking about witches. Just so interesting. I love unpacking this in greater detail with my students. Some of y'all are picking up on this, Mike. You're saying if it's seen by many, it must be true. You're totally right to pick up how in that text, right, it says, as is, commonly reported, as everybody knows. A lot of these texts use the rhetoric of as is widely known. We can talk more about that in a second. Just a really quick additional piece of text that I think is important. It's not just your average sort of disgruntled Dominican who is writing something like the Malleus Maleficarum. It's all the way up to the monarch. In the case of Scotland, James VI, who becomes James I of England in 1603, wrote the only demonological treatise ever penned by a European monarch. in 1597. And he himself had actually presided over a number of witchcraft trials. Quite interesting. He thought he was a victim of witches' magic. He thought that some witches in part of Scotland had thrown like a cat into the sea, and it had impeded his ability to sail back from Denmark with his bride. Very serious belief, he thought. But he talks about in his country, there's this fearful abounding of these detestable slaves of the devil. And basically is trying to resolve the doubting, saying such assaults of Satan are most certainly practiced, and the instruments thereof must be punished. If the king thinks it, if the king himself can be a victim of witchcraft, then who's to spare? And so showing the range of texts to my students is really crucial. And these texts form a self-legitimating discourse. That is to say, these texts report on trials that happened, and they themselves inform the trials. The more witches who are executed in making public confession, the more fodder there is for demonological texts, right? So it's a snake eating its tail, a self-legitimating discourse. Now, we're going to have to leave witches briefly so I can talk just quickly about the devil. But I do just want to say another really critical point that I stress in teaching about the witch trials is that the decline of the trials shows us just how messy history is and rejects on its face any linear interpretations for why things shift. Does anybody have any guesses if you just had to pull an idea out of your head, or what the first thing that pops into mind? Why would you say the trials ended? Just type it in the search box. Why did the trials end? What's the first thought that pops into your mind?
We're going to pause, give folks a chance to answer.
Why would you guess? Secularism. Okay, good. Enlightenment. All right, y'all have already started to hit the nails on the head. So when I ask students this, they almost across the board assume it's the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment ideas that had started to develop in the latter part of the 17th century and become even more important as you move into the 18th century, or some might say the scientific revolution and so forth. But that's not actually the case. The fascinating thing is that the trials started to decline prior to these Enlightenment ideas really gaining speed. And most of the critical thinkers, particularly in the scientific revolution, themselves believed in witches, right? Famously, Johannes Kepler, who was the person who established certain laws of planetary motion in the early part of the 17th century. His mother was accused of witchcraft, and he put up a sort of defense for her, saying that she's not a witch, but he certainly believed in witches, right? Isaac Newton believes in witches. All of these guys, Francis Bacon, they all believe in witches. And even into the Enlightenment period, there's still some level of that belief. But I think historians have really well established that the trials start declining in the middle part of the 17th century. And it's actually the decline of the trials that leads Enlightenment thinkers to doubt the beliefs that underpin them. And the reason the trials declined, and I think this is something that I think, Luann, you mentioned this earlier, if someone did, that there starts to be judicial skepticism. That is to say, at the court level, people start to question the extent to which the proof that had been presented was actually accurate. And one of the things that's part of that is the tightening of laws about torture and the rejection of torture as a way to get evidence. And once that happens, there are less outlandish confessions of sex with Satan and all that jazz. The fewer confessions, the fewer things to feed that machinery of that self-legitimating discourse of demonology. So talking about the decline of the trials and the relationship between the mechanics of the law and belief, and recognizing actually that the law can come before changes of heart, is useful for students to think about this in a more complex way. There's actually a lot more that I can say about this, but I want to sort of move forward into the history of the devil. But I guess I can pause and take maybe one or two more questions about witches before we get into Satan.
Yeah, I do have one question. Can you talk a little bit, and this may get off the chronology a little bit, and if it does, please sort of pause this and we can come back to it a little bit later. But there's one reference you have not made yet tonight, and you're going to see them all over Lexington this coming Saturday. Harry Potter.
Oh,
We
yes.
we love witches right now. We've
Yes.
got a
So
generation of kids raised on witches.
absolutely. So we are going to talk about this, about the
Okay.
supernatural and popular culture at the very end of the talk. So bear with
Okay.
me because that is
Will
really
do.
important. But what I will say is people had to stop being afraid of witches, really,
Yes.
before we could be fascinated by them. But I also
Right.
want to say that the line between fear and fascination, thread thin, right? Thread
Yes.
thin. And we'll talk about why that is. So that's a good preview for what's to come.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit then, sort of following on from the witch hunts and how I approach them, how I think about teaching the history of the devil, which, much like the devil himself, is a trickier business. The reason teaching about the devil, and often students who take my witch hunts class, which is a 200 level class, end up taking my advanced senior seminar on the history of the devil. I sort of joke that my witchcraft class is a gateway class to Satan, but the administrators love it when I make those jokes. But anyway, the teaching about the devil is a bit of a trickier business, partially because Satan is so central to the Christian story. And in some ways, to understand Satan, you have to start with God and with sort of the most fundamental, enduring question of all of Christian theology, which is that of why would an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-benevolent God allow evil to exist, right? Surely God would be able to prevent evil, and a compassionate God would wish to do so. That question is known as Theodicy, and wow, that's at the absolute center of so many people's concerns. Why does evil exist if God exists as this figure that's powerful and all-knowing and all-benevolent? The problem of evil is answered historically and through the building blocks of Scripture by the devil. The devil is the solution to that problem to some extent, that God is not himself the author of evil. He uses his hangman, his emissary, to do that. But it's tricky because, of course, people still hold this to be true for a whole host of reasons. Another reason this is tricky is, over 2 millennia ago, ideas about the devil come forth through the building blocks of Scripture, but there's not a coherent narrative really in the Bible of what the devil is. There's a tremendous amount of variation. And for students who believe in the devil still in a really profound way, more than they do witches, they bring this stuff into the classroom. And just as an illustration of some of this, this is a slide showing, this is 2013, so we need a newer poll, but it's a YouGov poll, which also skews a little bit younger and tends to skew a little bit more progressive. But polling errors aside, this is an image of beliefs in the U.S. In 2013 about the devil and possession. So belief in existence of the devil, nearly 60% say a definitive yes, 15% say don't know. I'm kind of surprised even that the don't believe is as high as it is. And then you can see the correlation of belief in the potential of demonic possession. So still a live issue, right? Satan in the world. Actually, as a side note, when I defended my doctoral dissertation all the way back in 2012, I began with an anecdote in my defense to show the continued presence of the devil in American life and political discourse. And that anecdote was that in 2008, right back in the day, Rick Santorum, who was a Republican presidential candidate in 2012, had claimed that America was engaged in spiritual warfare with the devil. And he spoke really explicitly about the father of lies, right, in one of his speeches. And kind of remarkable that you see very 17th century language replicated in the modern period. But the point there was, of course, that this is still very much present in our world. And so a lot of the work that I have to do, and I'm just going to go back to the previous slide for a second with my students in the class on the history of the devil, is dismantle assumptions that they may be bringing to the table. As I said, the devil is a creature of Scripture, constructed from both the Old and New Testament, but the Bible doesn't present a coherent narrative at all of the devil's history, function, or destiny. He's not really a creature with a blank slate per se, but a very opaque one, right? Or one that is quite marked by a lack of clarity. And this is most clearly illustrated in the case of Genesis 3. And I use this from a very early period with my students. So in Genesis, everybody knows that basic story, right? How Eve was tempted in the Garden of Eden by a cunning serpent who could speak, who told her to eat the forbidden fruit and disobey God. She does it, she gets Adam to do it, and it leads to the fall of man. Now, what's really important is that nowhere in Genesis is the tempter named as Satan. Nowhere. That is a 2nd century reinterpretation of the text. And it's one that becomes entirely pervasive and helps to explain the existence of evil in the Garden of Eden, reflects the importance of Satan in Christian theology, and also explains why fallen men and women, all sons of Adam and Eve, are forever vulnerable to demonic temptation, especially women. And this gets back to that question that was asked before. I think one of y'all in the chat mentioned, does this go back to Eve? It absolutely does. And again, it's not because of what Scripture itself says, but the interpretation and reinterpretation of Scripture. So it's really important to sort of challenge students to think about this in different ways, not to ask them to challenge their own beliefs. That's not what I'm trying to do, but rather to get them to understand how these ideas themselves are constructs, right? I see, Luann, you mentioned that exorcisms are on the rise, by the way. Yes, they are. The current pope, actually, who we tend to think of as quite a progressive figure, is really interested and fascinated by the devil, partially because of his own background. But there has been this huge demand for people to be trained as exorcists, both within the Catholic Church, but also within the rise of charismatic Christianity. So yes, much more I can say about this, and I'll really quickly mention possession as we move forward. So what do I do with this? So I give this example about Scripture. I talk to my students about the foundations of demonic belief, but how do I get them sort of comfortable with thinking about modern iterations of the devil and the way ideas about the devil continue to permeate both pre-modern but also modern discourses? So I'm going to tell you about 2 activities actually that I do that I think you can use in other ways in your classes. So this slide, it's intentionally blank because it represents the first thing that I do the first day of class in this devil class. I ask students to draw Satan, just to take a look, and if they're not comfortable, they can leave it blank. I always give students an out, but they can just draw a picture of the devil, whatever that might look like to them in their mind. And usually students depict something that's sort of red with horns, maybe the fires of hell. Some have wings, some don't. Some students draw Hitler. Some students draw a figure that they find really appalling, right? There's a whole range of things, but this gets us thinking about how everyone in that class, most of whom has probably never encountered the devil, or at least hopefully not in their daily lives, knows what he looks like. And that allows us to think about how the dissemination of beliefs happen and how people are conditioned to expect what they see, right? That is really critical. And you're exactly right, Lori. I'm just reading in the chat really, really quickly. The fact that you have a South American Pope, that is really important. And also to note the discussion of the exorcism, boy, did that have a big effect. All of these movies that came out in the late 20th century, Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, all of that, if you want to understand the satanic panics of the 1980s, you got to go back to that. It's really interesting. Natalie, I see you say you draw a handsome, charismatic character. Absolutely. So some people draw the devil at a crossroads. Some draw, as you say, a handsome, charismatic character. All of that, someone a little bit slippery, someone they cannot trust, just actually like the man that Bessie Wilson met on the crossroads in Edinburgh back in 1661, a man clad in black who tempted her with promises. A fallen angel, you're right, Linda, according to Scripture, he is described as beautiful. He doesn't really get depicted as grotesque until the 6th century when we start to have the first presentations of the devil. But the origins of the devil and the fallen angel story, that largely comes from the Apocrypha, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so this is where we get started. It generates conversations, right? People are really interested in it. That's the first activity that I do. The second activity that I do with students, just to get them thinking about belief, is what I call the talk to your friends about Satan assignment. And this image is actually from a Match.com commercial. I don't know if any of y'all saw this, but there were a number of series of commercials for Match.com in 2020. And the premise was like, we're already in hell. It's 2020. Now's the time for like the devil to emerge and find his match, right? And quite funny images. But the talk to your friends about Satan assignment, I ask my students to go and survey at least 3, preferably 5 of their friends, family members, whomever, just about what they believe about the devil. Again, I always have an opt-out if students are not keen. I've never had a student opt out. They're actually very interested in doing this. And what I find is that my students, a lot of them who grew up in Christian households, had a thought much about the devil, and their friends haven't thought much about the devil, yet they still have these core beliefs, core ideas. And that allows us to almost start from the present. What's the place of the devil in the modern world? And work backwards. It works fantastic. I actually have them generate like Pew Center style graphs and things. I do that in my ghost class as well. Starting with modern belief is such a good way in. You don't want to hit them over the head immediately with like hardcore theology, although we do a decent amount of that. So this gets us going. And from these early assignments, and I promise I'll pause in a second, Andy, to answer any questions. But one thing I do following on from these assignments then is begin to encourage students to try to make sense of things that are seldom or never seen, right? And to ask the question of how are our expectations, beliefs, experiences determined by the worlds through which we move, the waters through which we swim? And how is what we see and hear conditioned by what we've heard? And then how then does the way that we report things get informed by what we see and hear? So we're thinking a lot about experience and why that matters. And if a pre-modern person is experiencing death and famine and hardship, they may not be seeing the devil himself, but they're certainly seeing the fruits of demonic activity. And I also ask my students as part of this, what is provable? What does proof mean? How does the idea of evidence shift over time? Because what's really important is not just that pre-modern people believed in the devil. They also thought in a very systematic way about how he operated and wrote extensively about this, right? Really, really crucial. So I sort of encourage them to say, why not ask questions about angels on a pinhead if you believe in angels? Why not ask questions about demonic bodies and how they move through the world if you believe in demons? If you believe in a literal hell and if you believe in the bodily resurrection, then why not ask questions like how many bodies can fit there, which is what medieval people wanted to know. People wanted to know, do you defecate in hell? What does that look like? And these questions start to make sense when you build out the broader corpus of belief that formed the pre-modern world. So we talk a lot about that. I'm going to give you a really quick example about demonic possession, and then I'm going to pause and take questions about Satan before wrapping up. Does that sound good, Andy?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk about demonic possession as a test case for how I play with some of these ideas I've just talked about. Because of all the ideas about the devil and demons found in scripture, that of demonic possession is probably the most consistent and concrete. There are no fewer than 7 examples in the gospel of Jesus expelling demons from human bodies, right? Christ was the original exorcist. Students are like, what? That can't be true. And it is, actually. And it's because of this biblical precedent for the belief in the devil and his demons that we see numerous cases of demonic possession in the medieval era, and they become more and more important as we get into the period of the witch trials. So demonic possession cases, the height of them and the height of the witch trials, those coincide, right? That I think is really important, actually, because this is a world, a society that's anxious, that's worried about the involvement of the devil, and then Satan's at the heart of the witchcraft and possession cases. So how many people were possessed? It's hard to say with anything approaching precision, because possession's not a crime. So it's not recorded in judicial records and so forth. But based on the records we do have, we certainly know the number of demoniacs is in the thousands, right? Who's most likely to be possessed? All ages and genders could be struck, but you guessed it, young women in particular. And there are lots of reasons for that. The average age of a demoniac between 13 and 17. And that's a great way in to think about adolescence and gender and so forth. All of that is really crucial. Now, numbers, demographics aside, the prominence of demonic possession testifies to the importance and power that the populace lent to the idea of Satan and his ability to act on earth. So another thing I point out to students, I ask them, what does a demoniac do? And they all know the answer. So put in the chat, how do you know a demoniac when you see one? How do you know someone's possessed? Tell me some of the symptoms of possession. I know some of y'all have seen The Exorcist. So what does a demoniac do?
I'll give them just a moment. There's always just a slight drag in us. And
oh, that's fine.
There we go.
I'm
There's
used to
Mary.
pausing. Well, my students are like, wait, what did she ask? Okay, so Mary, writhing. Okay, writhing on the floor, changing voices, multiple voices, exactly. Floating over bed, head spinning around, speaking in tongues, vomiting, use of different voices, screaming satanic things, speaking in tongues, doing things not possible in nature, all of that. Green vomit. All right, Michelle, straight out The Exorcist. Perfect. So y'all are nailing it. Now, I'm guessing, I don't know definitively, but I'm guessing most of y'all have not witnessed a demoniac. Now, maybe you have, but probably the majority haven't. But everybody knows what a demoniac looks like because of popular media. That's the same as in the pre-modern period, right? Even if someone hadn't seen a demonic possession, they would have at least heard about one. People speaking in a deep tongue, parodying the church, speaking blasphemies, vomiting unnatural things, all of that. And they would have also heard about exorcisms, right? Catholics had all these formalized rites of exorcism, holy water, directing the unclean spirit to the host, so on and so forth. Protestants don't have very many good exorcism strategies. They just basically read scripture and pray. And of course, the casting out of demons continues today. But what's the interpretation of this? How do I get students to understand demonic possession? Because they always want to know, well, were people really possessed? Was that really the case? Now, that's not a question we can prove. It's just not. Historians work within empirical evidence. That's certainly the case. But I do say that the vast majority of the demoniacs believe they're possessed. 10 out of 10. There are, of course, some counterfeit demoniacs, but most people believe it. And they are unconsciously or consciously following scripts, playing a role that was encoded in their religious culture. They know what a demoniac is supposed to look like. If I ask any of y'all to act like a demoniac, you would know how to do it. And for pre-modern people, they absolutely were worried about the voice of the devil in their mind. They were worried about strange bodily feelings, urges that they weren't familiar with, that they interpreted as the devil. And whether or not it's true, that's not for us to determine, but they were very much following these scripts. And what made someone a demoniac was, at the core, how they were interpreted to be such by their audience. So it is to say, we see someone writhing on the floor today in a supermarket, we think, oh gosh, they're probably having an epileptic fit. But in this period, it depended on who interpreted that figure. And demonic possession was, for many, thought to be the key explanation. There's no way, I should say, for us to sort of prove whether or not folks were really ill or not. Probably there is some of that. Historians tend to shy away from medical explanations for events in the past because we're interested in belief and how that operates. So I use demonic possession as a case for explaining how roles and scripts and the water, again, that was swam in terms of belief and interpretation informs the devil in this period. So I'll pause before I move to a few concluding thoughts if Andy wants to ask any questions.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions that are queued up, and so I'm going to get to a few now. I'm going to invite you to conclude, and then we'll bring up some more. Let's see, this question is from Rashid. Rashid is joining us from Morocco tonight, and she's wondering if you can comment on this question. Do you think that projecting the devil in the modern time on the other is an abiding psychic need, or is it an ideological utility?
Oh, such a good question. That's a fabulous question. I actually have a slide talking about that, but I think it's the latter. I think it provides a solution often to a problem. It provides an explanation for why there are certain individuals operating in the world in a way that's contrary to the aims of a different society. Often the devil is a profound tool of othering, a way to define yourself too by negative self-definition. That is to say, right, those people over there, they are demonic, they are anti-human, they do X, Y, and Z. And by extension, that means on our side, we are not that. We are good, we are godly, whatever that is. So it's absolutely a tool for characterization. And one of the things to me, but I don't know if I think it's a psychic need. And the reason I don't think it's a psychic need is because every society throughout time and space has talked about others, right? Ethnic others, foreign others, others in terms of practice, whatever it is. But it's really only within Christianity, right, that because of association with the devil, they don't just become others, but they are also moral others. They are also evil. they are not just different, but they also may be anti-human, demonic. And that matters a lot for the sort of weight placed on othering and the project of demonization. So that's my interpretation. It's also the interpretation of a really fabulous scholar called Elaine Pagels, who wrote a book, Origins of Satan, and she writes about that. So I think this moral veneer on the other is wrapped up in the Christian idea of the demonic.
Fantastic. One more question. You can conclude, and then I've got a handful of questions before we leave the room tonight. This question comes from Melanie. Melanie's at Morgan State University in Maryland. And Melanie's wondering if, besides Tituba, you're aware of any other African-American witches. Do you have any texts to recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the period that I study, Tituba is really the only figure that gets accused of witchcraft within the system of the sort of Christian courts. And the reason I point that out is because one of the things that is noteworthy about the early modern witch hunts is there is not the attempt to accuse folks of other groups or other denominations of witchcraft. So that is to say, Protestants don't accuse Catholics, Jews, or sort of colonial others. That doesn't happen. And the reason is because they're generally not subject to prosecution through the dominant court system in this particular period. It's also partially because the project of witch hunting really is about eradicating any sort of deviance in your midst, and in that post-Reformation context, being the purest of the Christian confessions. So it doesn't lead usually to accusation of enslaved persons. And by the time actually of and what's interesting too, you don't even have it in the case, for example, of the Spanish don't hunt very many witches, which we could talk about that later. They kind of burnt themselves out with the Inquisition, and plus that's also a much more systematized process in certain ways. But the Spanish don't really do it in the so-called New World in the colonial context. And by the time the English and others really get involved in the transatlantic trade in enslaved persons, the heyday of the witch hunts has started to peter off. And you don't, for example, someone asked us at the beginning if there were witch hunts in Jamestown. There weren't, certainly not that I know of. So it's a long-winded question, but I don't really have any text because it's not a phenomenon I have read about in any extensive way. That may be because I'm a historian of witchcraft primarily in Europe as opposed to the Americas. But if you want to email me, I'm totally willing to look this stuff up if anybody has questions I don't get to or answer sufficiently.
Fantastic. Professor, we've got, I'm going to give you about 5 more minutes to conclude and then we've got some questions.
Yes. Okay. I will condense the 11 billion slides that I have left. No, y'all have had such great questions. This is so fun. I love teaching about this. So I will just say, by way of conclusion about the devil, this is what pops up if you search the devil in PowerPoint stock images, which I find funny because I have a very sort of demon-esque cat. So I'm adding this. The devil's a black mirror, right? The devil is a repository in some ways for our sort of perceptions of ourselves and those we call other. And I think that is really crucial. And in some ways, the supernatural writ large really is a statement about the society that imagines these figures, these beings, and also tries to imagine themselves sometimes in opposition of these individuals. So the question of why we should teach the supernatural, that's the overarching question. A couple of things just to say in really brief. The supernatural is never just about the supernatural, right? The supernatural is about fundamentally politics and faith and economics and economic anxieties, the development of the legal system, gender dynamics, consequences of social and political instability, all of those things. So when you teach your students the supernatural, it's never just about that. And students always remark that in my classes. I also think teaching about the supernatural encourages us to sit with historical discomfort. That is to say, not having easy answers. And not fundamentally even really being able to fully understand what we're learning. And that's important, right? And modeling that sometimes we don't know. Supernatural is interesting to teach because, of course, it's all over popular culture, as Andy pointed out. That picture of the book, A Devil in Scotland, is hilariously amusing to me because my first book was called Satan and the Scots. And sometimes when you Google The Devil in Scotland, this is the first thing that pops up, which is no doubt a book that has sold more copies than mine. But nonetheless, you also see the Monty Python, She's a Witch sketch, Hocus Pocus, all of that. The supernatural looms large in popular culture, and it's a way in for students, right? They know what the devil looks like. They know what demoniacs look like. They know what witches look like broadly. So it's a way to get them excited, right? It's a way then to get them engaged. And frankly, at a time when people perceive the humanities to be in crisis, which is a notion that I fundamentally reject, but it's nonetheless a way to get butts in seats. And that's really important. And I'll close on one comment, the one takeaway I want y'all to sort of think about. Elaine Pagels, who I mentioned before as the author of The Origins of Satan, she started studying the devil after the death of her husband, the untimely death. And she wrote that the reason she became interested in the supernatural and in Satan in particular was because she realized how our, quote, imaginative perceptions of what is invisible relate to the ways we respond to people around us, to events, and to the natural world. And this brings us, I think, to a critical lesson, right? The fundamental corpus of ideas that make up demonic belief in the witch trials, these are part of a movable, useful, dangerous fiction. The idea of an anti-human society in league with Satan, committing things like cannibalistic infanticide and magic and so forth. And this idea about witches that we've discussed, it derives from thoughts about heretics in the 12th and 13th centuries. And those ideas about heretics are derived from fantasies about the Jewish community, blood libel, and other anti-Semitic tropes. And those fantasies, those are derived from early fictions that some Roman authorities had about early Christians. Right, so supernatural also provides us these movable, useful fictions that don't die in the pre-modern world. And if you've ever read about the satanic panics of the 1980s, and even if you read about QAnon and Pizzagate and all of that, there's a similar core idea of this underground satanic cabal. And I think what's really important about that is this movable, useful fiction is a way for a community to define itself by who it's fighting and what it's not. So we might be a society who are in some ways past the devil himself, but we are not as a society past demonization. And in some ways, these more serious aspects of the supernatural is a way in to talk about that. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor. I've got a few questions that we'll use to conclude tonight, and I'm going to start with. So let me bring you this question from Charles, and it's going to lead to several other questions. Charles, who's in Eastern Virginia in Tidewater, asks if you can share with us when these topics of the devil and ghosts and witches, etc., when did they become topics of entertainment? When did they start to get humorized and become entertaining in and of themselves?
Oh, great question, Charles. And hi to another Virginian. So actually pretty early on. One of the things that's really important, and the reason I mentioned that part of the Malleus about the penis trees, not least because penis trees are sort of universally interesting, but from the beginning, actually, there is a little bit of humor that twinges on fear embedded in some of this, right? So there is this sort of elite, learned, demonic devil that's at the core of the witchcraft trials. But there's always these folkloric ideas that often embed humor, but people have to kind of keep that under the wraps or hold that in tandem with genuine fear. But the period in which you can start to really see a humorous devil take place in a major way is in the Romantic era, when people start to see the devil as a figure that could maybe be heroic, or could maybe be morally ambiguous, or could maybe even be funny. So here we're really talking about the latter part of the 18th century, early 19th century. I would say that it becomes a figure really of just pure entertainment is over the course of the 20th century, with the advent of for silent film and then other sorts of media to project new interpretations of the devil in a greater way. But even the witches of Macbeth are sort of entertaining, right? Yeah. They're also scary. Right. That's a play written for the demonologist king, but they sort of operate in both ways. So it's a great question. I think it's always there, but not crystallized until witches cease to be also fearful.
Great, thank you. Next question is from John. John is in Atlanta, Georgia. And maybe to take that question, the previous question a little further, you mentioned The Witch and your love of The Witch earlier. Can you recommend any films or shows about witchcraft that you recommend for sure, and then some that you think are the worst you've ever seen?
Yeah. Well, so I have my students do actually a pop culture assignment where I ask them to pick a popular representation of the witch trials and talk about the extent to which not just it's accurate or inaccurate, which is kind of an easy thing to do and maybe not especially helpful, but more to ask the question of does this presentation of the witch add to or detract from our understanding of the history? And they come up with all sorts of things. And I have to say, I actually don't think any of them. I think they're all useful ways in. So The Witch is the only thing that I would show as an accurate representation of witch belief. That's literally the only film I would show my students to say, use this as a way to understand 17th century Puritan witch belief.
Mm-hmm.
But
Great.
all the other things I think are great ways in, right? I mean, even the Crucible is not especially accurate in some ways, although it does draw on some Salem records. But it's a way in. So there's nothing that I say is terrible. What I really encourage folks to do is ask students to suggest ideas, because gosh, they've seen everything. There's a show called Supernatural. There's a new Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which is very interesting and feminist and important in certain ways. There's Charms. It's endless. So
Yeah.
asking students to find their own representation, to analyze it, that's the best way to go, I think.
Great. Here's the last question. This comes from Andy in Chapel Hill. And I'm wondering, Professor, I've noticed throughout the night and in the resources you've shared that we tend to genderize the devil, calling it him, right? And that we tend to capitalize devil. Talk to us a little bit about the ways you present the devil in those two contexts as a concluding thought.
Great question. The devil is almost always in this period. In fact, I would really say always represented as a he, partially because to envision a figure in the pre-modern world that was powerful, that commanded a legion, right, a legion of his own demons, that was in the way that most Europeans in this patriarchal society envisioned it, necessarily the positionality of a man. And I think in some ways, too, if you want a figure that can act as a tempter, someone truly opposing Christ in this way, and also a foil, a mirror for Christ's goodness, it's why actually I should say the New Testament is when the devil becomes really important. It's because also, that's the story of Christ in a lot of ways. The gender is just necessarily going to be male because of the power accorded to that figure. That's just the case in the early modern period. So we talk about that actually, because it has implications for then why so many of those who are susceptible to the charms of the devil, the lusts of the devil, all of that were women, because most people still imagine things within a very sort of heteronormative context. There, of course, were always LGBTQ plus folks in this period, but that's not how people envisioned the world, particularly theologians who are writing about this. And also, if you want to invert a Christian practice, and all witch beliefs are inversions, then you do so with also a male figure, because it's sort of within the bounds of what they think is just normative enough. So it's a really good question. More needs to be done on the gender of the devil, though. I think people have just thought about it as so assumed. It's what everyone in the early modern period uses, so they just replicate that. But there's more to unpack there. It's a really savvy question. I don't tend to capitalize the devil in my writing increasingly, but my editors often tell me to. And usually it's just because if you're not using Satan, which is the proper name, the devil represents that sort of personified figure of evil as opposed to lesser devils or demons. So it's just a way to represent that importance.
Right. Professor Brock, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing this narrative and your work. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you again.
Great. And anybody who wants to email me or follow me on Twitter or message me or whatever, I'm happy to answer additional questions. Y'all have been a really great audience. Thanks for playing along and hanging out a little bit late as I take us slightly past the 8:30 mark.
I want to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's session of the Humanities in Class webinar series. Please do follow our webpage as well as our Twitter feed for upcoming opportunities. As it turns out, we do not have a webinar next week. We have a week off because we needed to reschedule Ayanna Thompson's session on decolonizing Shakespeare. So no webinar next week. Instead, your homework is to go out and vote. Instead, we'll be seeing each other again on November the 9th. I'll be joined by Jody David Armour from the Law School at University of Southern California. He'll be sharing with us his work on the reckoning of the role of systematic racism in sparking of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. Thank you, everyone. Please have a great week, 2 weeks actually, in your teaching. Enjoy Halloween this weekend. We'll see you next time on the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.
Okay, Andy, are we still live?
We sure are.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.